the business model doesn't work online. And so online cannot afford to pay for journalism, because journalism isn't cheap. There's all of this rush toward community journalism where people call in news stories. And that works maybe for a tornado. I saw a tornado, or this house has been crushed, or whatever that is immediate like that. But good journalism where you analyze the sources, and compare the news as to its validity, and get the news behind the story. So much of cable TV's gone to opinion rather than news, and I don't have a problem with opinion. I don't have a problem with Fox or MSNBC or any of those. They're entitled to opinion, but who is paying for the original gathering of the news, which is just not cheap? And you can't bring in minimum wage folks to gather the news. You've got to pay for bright people who can figure it out and then can express themselves well. And so the business model is what's messed up most right now. How are they going to pay for the gathering of the news? Because the gathering of the news is not really changed a lot. The old notion of who, what, when, where, and how, that still works. You have to gather those things. You may have to write it in a different platform or show it in a different platform. But how to pay for it is the big unanswered question right now. And the person who figures that out, I don't know. A lot of it was they couldn't figure out how to measure the eyes. But now they can even measure the eyes. But the truth of the matter is that the advertisers have found that, why pay exorbitant prices for this? I'll just get on the opinion lines, which cost the salaries of a couple of talking heads, and that's it. Or somebody who's still charging the old lower rates. And so that is a problem that the industry has to figure out. The Tennessean had a reporter who was a character of the first order by the name of Jerry Thompson. He was a police reporter, and in his latter days before he died, he was a columnist. And the Banner's deadline for its city edition was, in those days, was at 12:20 or 12:15 or something like that. And we were sitting around. It was a slow news day, and so Jerry picks up the phone and calls the Banner city desk and says, "Hi, this is Johnson and Smith Funeral Home in Gainesville, Florida. I have an obituary for you." And he says, "I'm sorry, we don't want to take a local obituary." "Well, this is a local obituary. He's from Nashville." He said, "What's his name?" And his name is Clayton Veach. "Well, what's his connection here?" "Well, not much. He was killed in a jail escape." And he said, "What was his name again?" "Clayton Veach." They called his name Rabbit Veach. Well, Rabbit Veach was this really thin guy who was once supposedly tracked at a 9.3-100 at East High School. He was fast, and he was thin, and he could even get through some jail bars, And he had escaped from jails. He was a petty thief. Never hurt anybody, but just a petty thief. And so he was a notorious character. And when it was a slow news day, you always called up, did a story on Rabbit Veach. And he said, "Rabbit Veach is dead? Hold on just a minute." The guy says, "Stop the presses, hold the front page." They held the front page. They interviewed the funeral director, which was Jerry Thompson. "Oh yeah, he was killed, and he ran right into a police car and was killed." And so that afternoon, the Banner, Rabbit Veach killed, streamer story in Florida jail escape attempt. And they printed the story and didn't know any better until the next morning. Thompson, who was the police reporter, tracked down Rabbit Veach, who was in Nashville. And the Tennessean read the story and said, "I'm not dead, says the rabbit."
Wow. So you guys would do stuff like that all the time?
Oh, we would try and do stuff like that. We had a hazing thing where new reporters were always, we used to do an obituary on every person who died. And new reporters were given the obituaries late at night, and usually with not enough time. And so we had a new reporter by the name of Al Gore. And we had somebody call up and said, you know, he's from Carthage. Said, this is such and such funeral home in Carthage. He said, hello. And he said, we have an obituary for you. And he said, okay. And it was Trebla Iraq, which is Albert Gore spelled backwards. And he was this doctor, and he was killed in an automobile accident. He was taken to the hospital and later died there, and got his background. He was Swedish doctor. He just recently moved to his to Carthage, which is explain why Al didn't know him. And so on. He wrote up the obituary and turned it into the city desk. Of course, the city editor was in on this, because this was Jerry Thompson and the group back there. And so then, after he'd finished and turned it in, they called Al back and said, have you turned in the obit yet? And he said, well, is something wrong? He said, well, his wife was driving to the funeral home, and she had a heart attack and died on the way to the funeral home. Oh, my God. And so he said, yeah, give me the details. So they gave him the details. He got his story, obit back and sent it back. And then a few minutes later, the funeral home, quote unquote, called out, oh, you're not going to believe this. He said, what's wrong? And he says, well, they had two young teenage sons, and they were driving to the funeral home, and they drove off into the Cumberland River, and they're dead. And Al went up and says, I think I've got a story here.
Oh, wow. And
Al loves to tell that story, and I do too. But I mean, we pulled all these kinds of pranks and did that on Franks and wrecked weddings. You know, pulled out junk. We had a reporter by the name of Douglas Hall who was getting married when I was the city editor, and he bragged that we wouldn't find out where he was going on his honeymoon. So I assembled 7 reporters who worked for me on that. I said, we're going to find out where Doug is going on his honeymoon. You check these airlines, you check these hotels. They went out for about 3 or 4 hours, and they came back with long faces and said, we can't find him anywhere. All right, I said, okay, you take Louisville, you take Chattanooga, you take Knoxville, you take Memphis, and do the same thing there. And call the airlines for leaving out of there. And one of the reporters came back about 20 minutes later. Got him! I said, what's that? I said, he's out of Knoxville. He's spending the night at the Knoxville Hyatt Regency, and he's flying out the next morning to Jamaica, out of Knoxville on United Airlines. All right. And I said, what should we do? And one of the reporters said, let's cancel his tickets. And I said, come on, Bill. I can't believe you would say such a thing. There's no imagination there. Just cancel one ticket.
So did you guys do that?
You want me to admit to something like that? No, what we did was to leak back to him. That's what we'd done. So he would worry about it. So somebody leaked, you know, and became the traitor, false traitor, double agent, and would leak back. And that was where the fun was, to play the mind games all the way. I've got lots of stories, including the wrecking of my wedding, and or the attempt to do that. And so we did all those kinds of pranks. And we wrote love letters to one of the guys who was a sexist kind of guy who was always looking at women. So we had a woman in the office writing love letters that she admired him so, but she was afraid he was so good looking he would never pay attention to her. We would carry these on for months and do that. And we did the old gag where Charlie Fontenay bought something called a Borg Ward, which was like a Mercedes automobile from and he was bragging about it. So we asked him, what kind of gas mileage you got? And he said, oh, I'm getting 16 miles to the gallon, which in those days was great. Well, we started adding gas in to the gas tank. How's your gas mileage? We'd ask a couple of weeks. Oh, I'm up to 21 miles a gallon. Then we'd add even more to it, and we took him up to where he was embarrassed to say, well, I'm getting 40 miles a gallon. Oh, come on, Charlie. No, we're getting 40. Then we started backing it back down. I mean, this would go over a period of months, you know, that we'd do this, but it was fun to keep doing it. Somebody had the responsibility. And so we started siphoning out. And we got him down to 4 miles to gallon. And Charlie was writing these stories to, writing these letters to Borg Ward, demanding somebody come and help him with only getting 4 miles a gallon. So, you know, it was a fun place to work in those days, and pranks were a great deal of our fun around that. We didn't pull pranks on readers, but we pull them on other journalists and so on. But that was great fun.
That sounds like it was a blast doing that.
I'll tell you the worst prank I ever did, the most unethical prank, because I may pass the statute of limitations. I was covering the race for governor. Frank Clement was running. And Halls, Tennessee has a park where there's a 4th of July park. And what used to happen is that they would give, a candidate knew enough to give 3 speeches a day. He'd give 1 speech in the morning, so the afternoon papers would have a new lead. Then he'd give 1 at noon, you know, for TV folks to get whatever locally, and then he'd give an afternoon or evening speech for the AM papers. Well, on July 4th, he was only going to give 1 speech. It was going to be shortly before noon, and the banner was going to get the story, and nobody else. And I called the paper, my city editor named Herman Eskew. I'm not going to have a new lead tomorrow. He's only giving, no, you've got to have a new lead. But how am I going to get it? He said, that's up to you. But you've got to have a new lead tomorrow. I hung up the phone. Went out to Halls and looked at the picnic ground out there. 1 public pay phone out there. I grew up in telephone, rural country telephone company. So I went over to the pay phone and I unscrewed the receiver and took out the thing and screwed it back on. And so Clement gave his speech and the banner reporter came running over to call in the story right on deadline. He couldn't get through. They couldn't hear him. He cursed and slammed the phone down and tried to drive into Halls, but he didn't get there in time to make his deadline. I put the piece back in and called in my story. There is a lesson there for the reporters in those days. We didn't have fax machines to begin with, and certainly not laptops, and so we dictated stories just by reading their notes. We didn't have anything to write them on. And you learned to dictate a story, and sentences were a lot shorter and crisper and cleaner because you weren't adding multiple clauses and clogging up stories with too many adjectives. You know, you picked one and dictating over the phone. And that's where somebody who never done good in English like me learned, you know, to write, that you had to dictate, you know, and you had to dictate simple declarative sentences. Now you record, or people have it on the recorder, or there's a laptop where they're taking notes and they get to review it all, and it's changed it all. But forgive me for the good old days journalism, but it is a great exercise if you get to take notes, but without writing any story in your notes, be required to call it in